Congresswoman Spanberger, thank you for talking with me. I wanted to start pretty broad, if that's okay. Why should Virginians pick you to be governor?
Well, I'm asking Virginians all across the Commonwealth to vote for me because I want to continue serving Virginia. We have a lot of challenges facing our communities, whether it's challenges of affordability in housing, healthcare, and energy, or our desire to get our public schools, back towards being on track to be the best in the nation. And particularly as we see a climate of kind of chaos and disruption coming out of Washington, whether it's from the administration's tariff policies or from bad policies coming out of Capitol Hill, we need a governor who's going to be steady, focused on standing up for Virginia, putting Virginia first, and doing right by our communities and working to address the things that keep so many families up at night, issues of costs and the future of our kids.
You'd be in charge of a huge bureaucracy if you win. So I'm curious how that experience is going to lend itself to being governor and what your leadership style would be.
I think as governor, I will be attuned to asking the constant question of what's working and how can we make that better, and what's not working and how can we fix it. Certainly, even if we're looking towards the administration of Medicaid, as an example, because of the provisions from the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, it will fall on the state to confirm and validate someone's employment in order for them to continue to be eligible for Medicaid. Now, currently there's a backlog in the system for that work validation, and the new federal requirements will require kind of an even more frequent work validation. So here's an example of a place where we will need to create major efficiencies and a focus on effectiveness. Otherwise, Virginians will lose health care. And so bringing that mindset to all of our state agencies and to the work of leading the state is kind of how I view the job and an example of the types of things I'm thinking about now.
So how can you make life more affordable with so much help and funds going out of the system?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at it in sort of two different pieces, right? One will be the fiscal impact on the state of changes because of either the big beautiful bill or also the impact of DOGE, so many Virginians who've lost their jobs. Certainly, even UVA is projecting that in 2026, Virginia will have no notable job growth. Already, we know over the past 7 months, we have had increased rates of unemployment each month. So we're already looking at challenges as it relates to kind of tax revenue coming in addition to the One Big Beautiful Bill, meaning $26 billion out of our healthcare system. And then there's the separate priorities of lowering costs. The good news is that many of the priorities that I'm pursuing to lower costs are in fact themselves cost neutral. Some of it is legislative efforts, removing some hurdles from localities that might, in the housing space, that might wish to have greater flexibility in the housing they create and build. In the healthcare space, ensuring that people can use the pharmacies of their choices, or ensuring that PBMs aren't sort of blocking markets and eliminating competition. Some of these policies, many of the policies in my affordability plan, are an issue of kind of governance coming out of the state administration or legislative priorities to push through the General Assembly that, in and of themselves are cost neutral.
How willing are you to find other revenue sources like changing or adding new taxes? There was a digital tax that was proposed that ended up not making it through, and there's been sort of long-standing discussion about making Virginia's income tax more progressive.
Yeah, I think when you look at Virginia's tax system, certainly we haven't had updates to our tax system in many, many decades in a substantial, and meaningful way. We also have some taxes on the books that have been there since the 1700s and the early 1800s. So I think principally what I'm looking at is where are we going to be on our fiscal trajectory? We'll certainly know a lot more even at the end of September when we start to see how many more people might have taken that early retirement from the DOGE process in addition to those who were fired kind of at a point in time. But looking towards the future, I certainly am trying to determine what might be the revenue sources that might be additive, but also what taxes could we eliminate? Certainly, looking at the car tax as one. It's a complicated issue, and certainly I think that your listeners and viewers know that. But it is probably the most hated tax in all of the Commonwealth. But the key is how is it that we can ensure the revenues are able to pay for our schools and our first responders and the requirements of our communities, but also that there is a fairness and as it relates to the car tax, not the the yearly or biannual headache, depending upon the locality you live in.
Virginia determines how much the local school district needs by calculating its staffing needs, and that's sort of unusual across the country. One alternative is to make that more student-based, which funds districts according to a per-student cost. Is that something that you would be in favor of?
Certainly, as a question of what works, we've seen many districts or many states across the country employ that method. But specific to Virginia, there's a Jahd study that evaluated, I believe it's about 2 years old, almost 2 years old at this point, that looked at the student-based structure for funding schools and made recommendations about that being the most effective. So again, in this moment of a bit of kind of disruption, I think it's both a time where we need the governor to keep us steady, but also to look at where are places we can make substantial improvements. So it is something I have been digging deep into, both the Jahd study that's been out for some time, but then also the examples of states that have moved to a student-based school funding structure.
A big part of affordability is energy, and this is going to be a huge challenge for the state. Data centers are a big reason for this. They use tons of energy, and we have more and more of them across the state. The State Corporation Commission is already considering higher utility rates for Virginians, so that obviously impacts affordability. And there's some speculation that the climate goals that Virginia has and the Virginia Clean Economy Act are going to make it hard to balance that with reliability and energy prices and so forth. How do you think that the Virginia Clean Economy Act should be revisited or reformed, if at all?
As it relates to the Virginia Clean Economy Act, I think that there's a real need to be clear. I support the legislation and the principles behind it. I do think that there are areas where we can make some updates, in fact, based on increased technology. At the time that bill went into, became law, notably even battery storage capacity and capabilities is not what we know it to be today. So putting into place some provisions that account for the strength of battery storage, that incorporate newer technologies, I think is one important thing. I've heard discussions of doubts as to whether we can meet the goals, so do we just abandon it? I think that would be a mistake. It's a question of revisiting how can we continue to meet those goals in a changing landscape and recognizing the sort of dire circumstance for so many families of rising costs. As it relates to rising costs, what we really principally need to do is generate more energy here at home. And it's exciting that Virginia is going to be home to the largest offshore wind installation that ideally should begin initial generation of energy in the new year. But we need to continue to demonstrate leadership in the area of energy generation and also ensure that high energy users, such as data centers, are paying their fair share. And so looking at the SEC case going through, I think is an important element to see if in the end we will have a separate rate for high energy users, principally data centers.
In your energy plan, you talk about common sense locations for solar sites. I think abandoned mines was one, and that sort of thing. Would you support legislation that opens up those, by right instead of the current process of having to go through localities to site solar?
I think where we are right now is in a place where there's a lot of information that some of our localities that might be wishing to make decisions about solar may not have all the full information. As someone who served my whole time in Congress on the Agriculture Committee, knowing agriculture is Virginia's #1 private industry, and knowing that there exists a great level of concern about taking agricultural lands out of production for the purpose of industrial solar, I recognize why many localities across Virginia might have kind of started to say that they want to reject solar coming into their communities. However, there are many locations across the Commonwealth, such as abandoned mine sites or non-productive, non-agricultural lands where we could bring forth solar, creating important revenue streams for localities, and importantly, being central to lowering the costs for communities surrounding those sites. And so what I do think the state needs to implement, and I would as governor, is a statewide strategy. Recognizing that the sites that solar energy developers are going to want to come to are sites where they can put that energy onto the grid. So location matters, installation capacity and availability matters, And frankly, this is a place where I think our localities need to be working in concert with Virginia Economic Development Partnership, also to make clear that we are active participants in making communities and localities aware of the places, the resources that could be viable options to bring that type of investment, and in doing so allay some of the concerns that they may have related to loss of productive agricultural lands.
During this administration, there's been a turn away from directly addressing the legacy and lasting effects of racism to a certain degree. How would you do that differently?
I think that I would want our state, as governor, it will be my priority to ensure that we are teaching the full history of our Commonwealth and of our country. Certainly even looking at Virginia as the very specific example, we are the place where the ideas of the birth of our nation and our founding documents were created, were dreamed upon. We're also the place where slavery first came to the shores of what's now the United States of America. And you can teach and you can make sure that people understand that fulsome history together. And one does not negate the other. In fact, understanding the history of our country, and importantly, the history of Virginia, especially as we're coming up upon the 250th anniversary of our country, is essential. And so, I certainly, as governor, would want to ensure that every kid in school is understanding the full history of who we are, and that there was a bill, as an example, to have African American history, an AP course, count towards some of the history requirements towards graduation, and that effort was, not supported by the current governor. One of my daughters is taking that course, and she's loving it, and she's learning so much. And I think that it's important that we recognize that, all aspects of our history and the ways that we're allowing our students to explore, the good and the bad and the reality of our history is how we truly learn from it.
Race has kind of been a big part of the way that higher education institutions have experienced politics in the past, several months, especially with sort of the forced departure of UVA President Jim Ryan. You would have the opportunity to appoint people to the Board of Visitors. How would this recent history affect who you were appointing?
Yeah, I think principally as it relates to the universities, the public universities where the governor has the appointment ability to appoint the full board. And certainly we've seen the challenges at the University of Virginia, but we also saw the challenges at VMI where the board forced out the first Black superintendent who every year prior had received commendations for the extraordinary work that he had done. Having returned to VMI, the place he graduated from, after a long career and storied, successful career in the military, rising to the rank of general. And now we're seeing ongoing challenges at George Mason University. The role of governor is to appoint people who want to strengthen the universities that they will be serving on the board. It is not to drive any ideology or particular political goals of a governor or an administration. And so what I will be looking at in the decisions I'm making about board appointments is who wants to strengthen our public universities, who wants to make sure that they are having a long-term view for what it means to be successful. That means bringing in students. That means being drivers of Virginia's economy. That means graduating strong citizens into our community who might stay in Virginia, start businesses in Virginia, raise families in Virginia, or if they go someplace else upon graduation, reflect fondly of their time studying here in our Commonwealth. And really, my goal is to appoint people who are dedicated to strengthening our public universities, full stop.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about your plan to drive jobs to Virginia or expand the ones that are here?
Absolutely. So particularly during the time of economic instability, and we know that this year Virginia lost our place as the #1 place for business according to CNBC, and notably in their explanation of that change, one of the indicators or reasons for that decision was the loss of jobs because of the Doge attacks. Recognizing that the landscape has become a bit difficult in Virginia and the rest of the country because of Doge, because of trade policy from the White House, the list goes on and on. The role of governor, I think, is to endeavor to make the state as steady as we possibly can, and to look at the types of things that businesses are looking for when they are looking to make investments. It's workforce. What's the strength of our workforce? Are they ready to take the jobs and whatever business might be brought to a particular community? What is the school infrastructure? If they're looking to bring people to a community, certainly chief among those questions are what's the schooling like for our kids and what's housing like for our workforce. Depending upon the type of business, it's infrastructure, it's transportation capacity. Infrastructure includes electricity and broadband connectivity. And so as governor, I will work tirelessly to make sure that every opportunity to strengthen the components that make Virginia the top place to choose, affordable childcare, that those things, I'm thinking of the reality that they all go hand in hand, because they do when we're looking to bring investment to Virginia and ultimately additional jobs.
A lot of the housing policies that you're proposing are geared towards increasing supply. One was incentivizing bonding authority for localities, and I think that's kind of a big deal. Can you explain what that means and how that is going to increase housing?
Yeah, and I think this goes with there's a number of elements of our housing plan that put choice and ownership over expanding housing directly on localities. Certainly as a Dillon Rule state, sometimes our localities are limited in the things that they can do. And so to have a locality be able to underwrite and financially support new projects, or the components necessary to build in or bring forth a new housing project, is important. Allowing localities to be able to very quickly rezone and turn over buildings that might have previously been in manufacturing or some sort of other structure, to turn that into housing. The types of flexibility that our localities can and should have, I think, can drive local-based solutions that meet the needs of a particular community. I recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's kind of something that's a little bit oversaid, but if you've spent any time traveling across Virginia, so many of our communities are very different. And the solution for Abington is not the solution for Arlington, but ensuring that, alike, they both have the opportunities to really drive on the types of housing development or growth, whether it's high rises, whether it's apartment buildings, whether it's new residential developments, that all of those opportunities and decisions are important, but enabling localities to be able to do it and support them is a priority for me.
This is an important election. Every time we have an election, we always hear it's the most important ever, but obviously there's always stakes involved. Can you talk about what the stakes are in this election and how that should influence people's choice when they go to the ballot box?
Well, I think the decision in this election is a consequential one, because there are very significant differences between the policies that I'm pursuing and the ideas that I'm putting forward than the ones that I am hearing from my opponent. Chief among them, as so many people are talking about, issues of affordability. Not only was the first plan that I put out focused on affordability and lowering costs, but I also recognize the real kind of dire circumstances of the position we may be facing into the future because of DOGE, because of tariffs, because of the so-called one big beautiful bill. And you cannot contend with threats to your economy. You cannot contend with real fiscal issues if you don't even kind of assess them as real, or if you are choosing, as I would say my opponent is, to kind of put loyalty to a president and his talking points above the real economic impact on Virginians. And so in addition to having a real plan to address issues of costs, I also want to put Virginia on path towards strengthening our public schools, ensuring we have the best in the nation. And my opponent for her entire career in politics has focused on defunding public schools, issues of basic rights. I support the constitutional amendments that are moving forward to ensure restoration of rights for someone who's been through our criminal justice system. Certainly Virginia is among the very worst in the nation for permanently disenfranchising people. Virginia still has a ban on same-sex marriage in our state constitution, and I support removing that. My opponent has said she's morally opposed to it. And Virginia has a constitutional amendment moving forward related to codifying essentially the standard of Roe versus Wade to ensure that women and their families and their medical providers can make their own independent decisions without undue influence from from the government or from people in politics. And my opponent has also said she's morally opposed to that. So, on issues of policy, the choice is very different, but also it's an issue of leadership at this moment where we do see chaos coming out of Washington, whether it's in policy or just in the divisive rhetoric. I believe that Virginia needs a governor who wants to be steady and focused on ensuring that Virginia continues to be a great place to raise a family, a great place to make a business investment, to grow a business, to attract business, or to retire. And so I'm focused on the actual sort of brass tacks elements of how we do that. And I think that when making the comparison side by side of who's going to lead the Commonwealth at this time, particularly when we see a real tension within our politics, I would argue that I am the better choice to demonstrate and continue to demonstrate that type of leadership. It's certainly the background of service to the country that I bring from my time as an intelligence officer and a federal agent, but also it's a demonstrated skill set that I brought to my time on Capitol Hill when I was the most bipartisan member of Congress from Virginia. And what that meant is I was building out coalitions constantly and consistently to just get things done to benefit the people I served in Congress. And so I'm looking forward to this election. It's an exciting time, and with early voting beginning, I hope that Virginians understand that we have such an extraordinary opportunity to be among the first in the nation to go to the polling places. It's 2025, it's just Virginia and New Jersey with statewide elections. And so it's a responsibility, but it's also an exciting time.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the VPM YouTube channel, hit the bell for notifications, and visit vpm.org for more in-depth coverage.